Hi, and welcome to my coverage on Pearl Harbor today. I guess I was lucky to start a YouTube channel just a handful of months before the anniversary because I was considering making a coverage of Pearl Harbor a few videos in, but then when I realised it was going to be the 80th anniversary this year, I thought might as well get on that now. Yes, this is Alan, by the way. I'm sitting down and I'm doing something, therefore he must sit on my lap. So for those of you who are new to the channel, what I do is I like to take a historical figure or an event and I like to do a history video of them first and then do a rankings video afterwards. Yeah, this is my first foray, as it were, into World War II. I knew we would get here eventually. Beforehand, I've mostly just done Tudor history stuff. And those who have seen my videos before know I tend to be kind of silly during my videos, but this time I'm going to tone that down quite a bit because I know that this is an event that carries a lot of gravitas because we all have family members that served in the Second World War, some of whom we probably remember from our childhood. And for you Americans out there, you may have a relative that was at Pearl Harbor on that day. So yes, this video is dedicated to those who died at Pearl Harbor. As a mark of solidarity, I am wearing my poppy for this in front of the camera stuff because the poppy is a very prominent British symbol when it comes to remembering those who fell in war. I've come to learn that in America, when you have your Memorial Day in May, then you sometimes do wear poppies as well. So I'm going to wear my poppy as an act of memorial. So if you like the video, please make sure that you like, share and subscribe because that really does help against the algorithm. And if you like what I'm doing here, please consider becoming a patron. These people here do an amazing job of supporting the channel and helping me make more videos, especially my VIP patrons, Anastasia Gracia, Alison Cuff and Larissa. Thank you guys so much. Let's get into the video so I can feed Alan. Before December 1941, the United States of America was still a relatively young nation, not yet 200 years old, that had never known a devastating attack on their territory that wasn't independence or Civil War related. American civilians had been killed at sea during World War I, but that was a series of attacks over a few years that led to it, and the risk of German U-boats was already well known. It wasn't a single event that pushed them towards joining the war. On the 7th of December 1941, when the Imperial Japanese forces attacked the United States Navy and Air Force base at Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, the Americans were unprepared, hadn't received proper warning, didn't believe their enemy was capable of attacking them, and did not receive an official declaration of war until after the attack. In the span of 2 hours, over 2,300 airmen and seamen were killed, as well as 68 civilians. This was the first time America stood on the world stage and said, "I have been wounded. I demand vengeance." Within a year of the attack, the events at Pearl Harbor were already being reenacted on the big screen as propaganda to encourage other Americans to join the fight against the Japanese Empire and the Axis powers they were allied with. The memory of that single day is still strong in the American consciousness, pointed out as the moment America joined the Second World War and showed they were not a force to be reckoned with. They would not know another impactful moment that changed their history like this for another 6 decades. The United States' involvement in World War II began and ended with world-shaking tragedies. It has been 80 years since the infamous day, and on this anniversary I would like to look at the history of what happened before, during and after the attack on Pearl Harbor. In a follow-up video I will be looking at the many ways this event was portrayed on screen, ranking each version from worst to best. The aftermath of World War I showed every effort to prevent another war, but we all know that everything from the Treaty of Versailles to the League of Nations only built the foundation for the second one. In Japan, the empire had ceased isolationism in the 1850s and was rapidly trying to catch up with the industrial and military might of Western nations, such as the British Empire and the United States. Surrounding Asian states were being colonized by white nations, and the Japanese feared being subjected to the same treatment. They sought to defend themselves with a strong military to rival other forces in the Pacific. Following the end of World War I, Germany was made to cede their overseas territories, and Japan, who had joined the Allies at the time, were given colonies in China and islands in the South Pacific. In the 1920s, two things happened which would increase the likelihood of war between Japan and America. Firstly, the Philippine Islands came under occupation by the United States, which could be used as a base to attack Japan if they ever felt the urge. Secondly, in 1926, Hirohito became Emperor of Japan. Hirohito came to believe that it was his destiny to unite all of Asia under his reign. From the 1920s onwards, America and Japan were at a state of high tension, and war between them seemed inevitable. But the former was assured that they had the upper hand, owing to their annexed territory in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the Hawaiian Islands. Pearl Harbor, near Honolulu, was a perfect jumping-off spot for their Pacific Naval Fleet if their territories in Southeast Asia were attacked. If it was attacked by submarines, the shallow water of the harbour wouldn't allow traditional torpedoes to hit their targets, and said submarines would easily be sunk. What's more, Japan also did not have access to steel and oil, as the Americans did. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in northeast China to seize more oil. This was done by making a false flag attack, wherein the Chinese were framed for bombing a train station, and the invasion succeeded within a day. The occupation and the means for which it succeeded was condemned by the League of Nations, which was an early attempt at the United Nations, who dubbed it as ethically illegitimate and demanded that Japan withdraw. Japan refused, leaving the League of Nations in 1933 and expanded into other Asian territories, including colonies owned by the French and British empires. Activities such as this gave other governments encouragement to expand their own borders. Benito Mussolini invaded Abyssinia in 1935, and Adolf Hitler's invasion of Poland sparked the Second World War, laying the impotence of the League of Nations bare to the rest of the world. Another territory that Japan had their eye on was the US-owned Philippine Islands. However, they had thus far avoided conflict with the United States by not touching their stuff, and Japan did not yet have the forces to match them. Come the start of the Second World War, Japan joined with the Axis powers of Germany and Italy in September of 1940, signing the Tripartite Act in Berlin. This was beneficial to the two European dictatorships. Hitler and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union had agreed to a non-aggression pact, so Germany would not expand into Russia, but the pact was designed to be broken. Therefore, if Russia was fighting Germany on one front and Japan on the other, whom they had previously lost to earlier that century, it would be easier to seize the larger nation. Keep in mind this was all theoretical. We all know what happens when you try to invade Russia from the west. Meanwhile, the United States was decidedly neutral in the face of the war. Though they profited from selling munitions to Europe, they refused to engage in a war they believed they had no part in. Still, they were considered powerful and the only obstacle stopping Japan from becoming the mightiest force in the Pacific. If they were to succeed, Pearl Harbor had to be taken out. The plan to attack Pearl Harbor began in early 1941 and developed throughout the year until that fateful day. The naval officer put in charge of preparation was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was considered ideal for this responsibility because of his talent for naval aviation, and air power was essential if the Japanese wanted to take America by surprise. Admiral Yamamoto himself was against the idea of war against the United States, due to Japan's comparatively inferior manpower. However, not only was Yamamoto the son of a samurai, but a member of the infamous Black Dragon Society, which considered themselves a new form of samurai fundamentally devoted to the emperor, whose divine right was not to be questioned. He was honour bound to bring the Second World War to the United States, and he at least understood that their target's forces were not invincible. For any chance of victory, the American forces had to be taken out in one devastating blow, which would give Japan time to invade other territories and solidify their control over colonies they already owned. Yamamoto asserted that a successful attack must not only crush naval resources, but also crush their morale, to such an extent that it cannot be recovered, and therefore the Axis powers would be secured on both sides of Eurasia. The attack plan was kept under strict confidentiality to retain the element of surprise. Regardless, over the preceding months, rumours of war grew stronger around the city of Tokyo. Joseph Grew, the American ambassador to Japan, heard from another country's diplomat that the Japanese, in case of a break with the United States, are planning to go all out in a surprise mass attack at Pearl Harbor. A rumour that the ambassador quickly scoffed at. When he passed the news on to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Hull in turn passed it on to War Secretary Stimson and George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Marshall considered a potential attack on Pearl Harbor would be done as a landing party and believed the forces already present on Oahu would deter invaders from an amphibious attack. Stimson himself was assured that Oahu was the strongest fortress in the world. From the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, intelligence on the Pacific Fleet's routines and schedules was sent back to Tokyo, which allowed Yamamoto and the officers under him to plan their attack more concisely. In July of 1941, the fall of France led to the seizure of French Indochina. The Americans ceased their oil exports to Japan. Japan, in retaliation, invaded the Dutch-owned East Indies. A month later, Franklin D. Roosevelt said that America would retaliate if the Japanese continued to attack neighbouring countries, that is, colonies owned by America's friends. Japanese and American diplomats argued for the next 3 months over Japan's occupation of Southeast Asia. On the 26th of November, they had failed to reach an agreement, and 5 days later, Emperor Hirohito gave his final authorization to carry out the attack on Pearl Harbor. The shallow water of the harbour would be an obstacle for attackers, which was what made the Americans so confident that they would never be a target there. Yamamoto pressed on, determined to achieve surprise over the Americans above everything. To tackle the torpedo problem, a new projectile, the Type 91, was developed, where a block of wood was attached to the tail fin that detached upon hitting the water, which gave it a better angle once submerged and would be more likely to hit a target. It was also given an anti-rolling controller which stopped it from losing momentum. Torpedoes that didn't immediately hit their targets would sink and be crushed by water pressure, so only experienced airmen would be given the chance to release such an artillery. These new developments would allow newer pilots to be just as dangerously armed. On the 26th of November, when peace talks with the United States all but failed, the Japanese fleet of aircraft carriers departed from Hitokapu at 6 a.m. The task force travelled gradually west towards the centre of the Pacific Ocean. On 1st of December they had, as mentioned, been given clearance from the Emperor himself to go ahead with the attack, and the carriers containing the 408 aircraft turned steadily south, approaching the Hawaiian Islands from the north. Reconnaissance was taken by 2 float planes prior to the attack to scout Oahu and Maui to ascertain the exact location of the US fleet. These planes were designed to avert suspicion from any islanders who might see them. The Japanese also deployed a fleet of 28 submarines. 23 of them were fleet submarines, and the other 5 were midget submarines. At 3:42 a.m. on the morning of the 7th of December, one such midget submarine was spotted by a small ship known as a minesweeper named the USS Condor, southwest of the entrance to Pearl Harbor. At 6:37 a.m, another submarine was sunk by the destroyer USS Ward, but it wasn't clear if this was the same one that had been spotted by the Condor. Elsewhere near Ford Island, a seaplane tender, the USS Curtis, avoided a torpedo by another submarine that was later sunk by the USS Monaghan. At this time the attack was already underway. The fate of another midget submarine, the Ha-19, which ran aground on the east side of Oahu the day after the attack, would lead to the capture of the first Japanese prisoner of war, Kazuo Sakamaki. The 4th and 5th midget submarines likewise sank. One would be found in 1960, another found in pieces between 1992 and 2001. It is important to remember that Japan only declared war on the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when they were still putting out the fires and recovering the dead from the water. This is what makes the attack so devastating in the eyes of Americans both back then and now. Admiral Yamamoto intended to delay the attack until it was absolutely clear that peace talks with the United States had failed. However, the order did not reach the fleet in time, and the attack went ahead. Tokyo sent a 5,000-word notification for the Japanese ambassador in Washington, D.C., but transcribing it to him took longer than planned. It wasn't until an hour into the attack that it was presented. This might have been Japan's official declaration of war, but the US government, who had been able to see the notification hours before it arrived via code breakers, believed it only to be the indicator that peace talks were failing. As a result, the attack on Pearl Harbor by Japan has been considered a war crime. Despite the delays and secret documents, the attack happened without the formal declaration. Debate still exists over whether the United States government were fully aware that Japan was prepared to go to war with them. Had the Japanese ambassador managed to receive the full notification on time, the final 2 paragraphs, as identified by Gordon William Brand, was not even a formal declaration of war. It did not even rupture the diplomatic relations, it merely broke off the discussions. Indeed, the final paragraphs alone do not not officially authorise the end of peace negotiations between diplomats, nor does it give a formal declaration of war. Thus, the earnest hope of the Japanese government to adjust Japanese-American relations and to preserve and promote the peace of the Pacific through the cooperation with the American government has finally been lost. The Japanese government regrets to have to notify hereby the American government in that view of the attitude of the American government that it is impossible to reach an agreement through further negotiations. Japan's assault on Pearl Harbor consisted of 2 waves. The first involved 189 aircraft, although 6 failed to launch, that targeted the greater assets of the US fleet and prevented immediate counterattack, namely Battleships, the first group, Ford Island and Wheeler Field, the second group, and Hickam Field and Kaneohe, the third group. Had the US military managed to make their post at Opana Point fully operational, they might have had some warning. When the first wave of aircraft was detected by Privates George Elliott Jr. and Joseph Lockhart on SCR-270 radar, they reported it to Ford Shafter's Intercept Center. This centre was supervised by the newly assigned Lieutenant Kermit A. Tyler, who had believed they had detected incoming B-17 bombers that were scheduled to arrive from California. This is justified as the American bombers and the Japanese planes' approach were quite close together and the actual size of the formation was not specified. As the Japanese approached Pearl Harbor, warning was once again hindered when US aircraft that saw them were shot down, some of whom were civilians, and sightings were still awaiting confirmation. At 7:48 a.m, the attack on Pearl Harbor officially began. Realizing that surprise had been achieved, Commander Mitsuo Fushida, who led the first wave, radioed back to Admiral Yamamoto, "Tora, Tora, Tora," which was the code word to begin. Those in the harbour at the time were either still asleep or preparing for the day. The peace of another beautiful morning in Hawaii was suddenly shattered with explosions, fire and alarms. The Americans on the ground could not immediately retaliate as all munitions lockers were locked. Guns were unmanned and even the airmen couldn't immediately jump in their planes and start fighting back as they were packed together out on the tarmac. After the initial surprise of the first wave, the second came in, led by Lieutenant Commander, I'm going to really mispronounce this, Shigekazu Shimazaki, taking out 3 groups of planes on Kaneohe, Ford Island, Barber's Point, Hickam Field and Wheeler Field. This consisted of 171 planes. 4 failed to launch. Of the 8 battleships which were anchored in the harbour, 4 were damaged and the other 4 were sunk, as they were among the key objectives. In the chaos, some managed to keep their heads and retaliate. Joseph Tossig Jr., who was stationed on the Nevada, was wounded, but managed to command the anti-aircraft guns. He would lose his leg in the skirmish. Also on the Nevada was Lieutenant Commander F.J. Thomas, who managed to get the ship moving so she wasn't a sitting duck and grounded it off Hospital Point to prevent her sinking. The West Virginia and the Tennessee were moored alongside each other. Both received heavy bombardment. When an explosion happened on one ship, it would carry over to the other. Thanks to Lieutenant Claude V. Ricketts, action was taken on the West Virginia that prevented her from capsizing. Her captain Mervyn S. Bennion remained on board to defend the ship until he was killed by shrapnel from an explosion on the Tennessee. Another notable story of heroism on the West Virginia was that of Dory Miller, a mess attendant and the ship's heavyweight champion who was serving breakfast when the attack began. His battle station destroyed before he got there, he saw to carrying the wounded out of the line of fire. Miller later took command of one of the starboard guns, firing until he ran out of ammunition, downing 2 planes. Crew finally abandoned ship after it was clear the ship would not be saved. The Tennessee, meanwhile, was trapped by sunken ships. She did not suffer the same fate as the Arizona, however, as the 2 bombs dropped on her didn't detonate properly. The ship was surrounded by flaming oil from the West Virginia, so sailors couldn't simply jump into the water to escape, or they'd be burned alive. The crew managed to stay afloat and shot down 5 Japanese aircraft. The Pennsylvania was in dry dock undergoing a refit. Nevertheless, the crew rushed to battle stations. Japanese torpedoes failed to destroy the dry dock and flood it. Later it was deliberately flooded to prevent the spread of fire from 2 destroyers, Cassine and Downs, which were also in dry dock. They managed to shoot down 2 Japanese aircraft, but the Oklahoma next to the Maryland was immediately targeted and was one of the first to be hit. Torpedoes struck below the waterline and she immediately began to sink and leak oil from her hull. The crew were unable to man the guns and fight back. It took a dozen minutes for the Oklahoma to cap and for her crew to abandon ship. Some crew members were still trapped below deck. A civilian yard worker, Julio de Castro, managed to save 32 sailors by cutting through the hull. The Mary Maryland had recently returned to the harbour where her crew were preparing for shore leave that would begin at 9 a.m. that day. Many crew members of the Oklahoma climbed aboard the Maryland and helped her crew with anti-aircraft defences. It was then struck by 2 armour-piercing bombs. Regardless, defence continued, as well as firefighting and saving sailors from the Oklahoma. It suffered few casualties, 2 officers and 2 crewmen. The Japanese would claim it sank, but it was only damaged. The California was moored by itself behind the other 6 battleships on Battleship Row off Ford Island. Lieutenant Commander Marion Little mustered his men immediately after the attack began, beginning to retaliate against the Japanese aircraft by 8:03 a.m. They quickly ran out of ammunition and had to stop firing to unlock other magazines. 2 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers dropped torpedoes that hit 2 minutes later. Because all the watertight bulkheads were open for inspection, the California quickly started flooding and she listed to port. Anti-aircraft defence still continued until 10 a.m. when the engine room was filled with smoke and those pumping water out of the ship from there were forced to evacuate. The damage to the California resulted in the deaths of 98 men. The USS Arizona would be the only battleship stationed at Pearl Harbor that could not be salvaged afterwards. At 8 a.m. she was bombarded by 10 Nakajima B-5N2 planes, which fired armour-piercing bombs at her. These bombs damaged several parts of the ship at once, and the resulting fire lasted 2 days. Out of the 1,177 crewmen on board at the time, 1,512 were killed. Lieutenant Commander Samuel G. Fuqua managed to get the few survivors off the ship and quelled fires long enough to evacuate. The USS Enterprise, no, not that one, was already out of the harbour when they received word that the naval base was under attack. She was, however, ordered not to return to the harbour, and they launched an unsuccessful attack on the Japanese fighters from where they were. She returned the day after and was ordered to refuel, resupply, and patrol the islands for any possible additional attacks. The naval hospital at Pearl Harbor was clearly in the line of fire for the Japanese planes, but it only received slight damage and it was not actively targeted by any bombers. Remember that, because when we get to the rankings next time, oh boy. Junior officers in the Japanese forces asserted that there must be a third wave of attack in order to destroy all fuel and dry dock facilities if they weren't planning to invade the island afterwards, as it would greatly hinder chances of repairs. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo withdrew the idea, and Yamamoto supported him in this decision, though he would later voice regret for not issuing a third strike. After 2 hours, the attack on Pearl Harbor finally ended. 19 ships had been damaged or sunk. Battleships, destroyers, cruisers, etc. 188 aircraft had been destroyed while 159 had been damaged. News of the attack reached the White House within the hour of its beginning. By 2:20 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the White House press secretary announced, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor from the air and all naval and military activities on the island of Oahu, the principal American base in the Hawaiian Islands." The first radio station to broadcast the attack was CBS on World News Today at 2:30 p.m. On NBC Radio, they had to interrupt a dramatization of the Inspector General to broadcast the news. On the 8th of December, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress to deliver one of the most famous speeches given by an American president since the Gettysburg Address. Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval air forces of the Empire of Japan. The United States was at peace with the nation, and, at the solicitation of Japan, was still in conversation with its government and its emperor, looking toward the maintenance of peace in the Pacific. Indeed, 1 hour after Japanese air squadrons had commenced bombing in the American island of Oahu, the Japanese ambassador to the United States and his colleague delivered to our Secretary of State a formal reply to a recent American message. And while this reply stated that it seemed useless to contribute to the existing diplomatic negotiations, it contained no threat or hint of war or of an armed attack. It will be recorded that the distance of Hawaii from Japan makes it obvious that the attack was deliberately planned many days or even weeks ago. During the intervening time, the Japanese government has deliberately sought to deceive the United States by false statements and expressions of hope for continued peace. The attack yesterday on the Hawaiian Islands has caused severe damage to American naval and military forces. I regret to tell you that very many American lives have been lost. In addition, American ships have been reported torpedoed on the high seas between San Francisco and Honolulu. Yesterday, the Japanese government also launched an attack on Malaya. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Hong Kong. Last night, Japanese forces attacked Guam. Last night, Japanese forces attacked the Philippine Islands. Last night the Japanese attacked Wake Island, and this morning the Japanese attacked Midway Island. Japan has, therefore, undertaken a surprise offensive extending through the Pacific area. The facts of yesterday and today speak for themselves. The people of the United States have already formed their opinions and well understand the implications to the very life and safety of our nation. As Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy, I have directed that all measures be taken for our defence. Always will our whole nation remember the character of the onslaught against us. No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous mind will win through to absolute victory. I believe that I interpret the will of the Congress and of the people when I assert that we will not only defend ourselves to the uttermost, but will make it very certain that this form of treachery shall never again endanger us. Hostilities exist. There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger. With confidence in our armed forces, with the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph. So help us God. I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese struck other locations in the Pacific, knowing the US Navy would not be in a hurry to stop any invasions. These included Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong, which were territories controlled by the British Empire at the time. Another target was the long-coveted Philippine Islands, and the US Navy was powerless to stop it. Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, would later observe of the ordeal. "In all the war I have never received a more direct shock. As I turned and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank in upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific except for the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Over this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we, everywhere, were weak and naked." Through him, Britain had promised it would declare war on Japan within the hour of an attack on the United States. The United Kingdom officially declared war 9 hours before the United States had a chance. America was now officially part of the Second World War, joining the Allied powers of the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, Poland, Free France, Czechoslovakia, among others. Franklin D. Roosevelt would be seen as part of the Big Three alongside Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin. As part of America's retaliation, anger festered looking for someone to blame. This led to a years-long persecution against Japanese American citizens who were considered potential spies. While the fires were still raging on Oahu, the authorities rounded up residents of Japanese descent and imprisoned them in high-security camps. On the west coast of the mainland, where a lot of Japanese Americans were living, they were initially defended by the Los Angeles Times as good Americans born and educated as such. It took all of 6 weeks for public opinion to change. As per Executive Order 1966, over 110,000 Japanese Americans on the mainland were held in internment camps. A similar situation happened on the west coast of Canada and British Columbia, where 2,000 people of Japanese descent were interned. One notable inmate of these camps was George Takei, who would later go on to play Sulu on Star Trek. This action has been considered more than a little controversial in American history. For decades afterwards, those unfairly incarcerated without due process sought for compensation. It wasn't until almost a year after the Second World War had ended that the final internment camp was liberated. However, it wasn't President Harry Truman that would repeal Order 1966. It would be Gerald Ford 30 years later. In some ways, the US Navy was fortunate to have been attacked while their major assets in the Pacific Fleet were docked in the relatively shallow water. Whether sunk or severely damaged, all the battleships besides the Arizona managed to be restored for active duty within a matter of weeks, ready to face the Japanese. It can be argued that if warning of the attack had come sooner, and the battleships mobilised outside of the harbour, they would have sunk in deeper water surrounding the island and would have been impossible to recover. The first official time America would face the Japanese in combat after Pearl Harbor was in January 1942, when the USS Enterprise, still not that one, attacked the Marshall Islands. Admiral Hara Tadaichi said, "We won a great victory and thereby lost the war." They hadn't managed to target the US aircraft carriers, all of which remained untouched, as it was the belief that the battle for dominance over the Pacific was going to be fought by battleship and not aircraft and submarines. The Japanese had hoarded a fleet of their own battleships in vain. In the long term, Yamamoto's gamble to attack America at its heart to gain swift victory did not pay off. A quote arose that has since been disputed, that reads, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." Though this may never have been said by the Admiral, it is a fitting declaration given his state of mind at the time. The US Navy base at Pearl Harbor is still active today. It is also a national park and holds several memorials and museums attributed to that fateful day. One of my earliest memories I have was April of 2000. I was just a few days away from my 5th birthday, which I didn't know was going to happen until we got to New York a few days later on the actual day. Me and my family were vacationing in Hawaii, and I remember one of our outings was to Pearl Harbor. Of course, I didn't know its historical significance at the time. I was just excited about getting to go on a submarine. They were filming the Michael Bay movie while I was there, and we were staying in the same hotel as him. As for going into one of those submarines, I have to say, for a 4-year-old who would grow to the colossal height of 5'3", I found it tiny and claustrophobic. The USS Arizona wreck is still visible in the clear water of the harbour. On the 75th anniversary, President Barack Obama and Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe visited Pearl Harbor to mark the event. It was the first time a sitting Japanese leader visited.
Wars can end. The most bitter of adversaries can become the strongest of allies. The sacrifice made here, the anguish of war, reminds us to seek that divine spark that is common to all humanity.